they would pour through all the news accounts so that they could find out all the minutia. And sometimes they would remember stuff, or they'd bring stuff out that I didn't even remember because it turned out not to be important, but it was important at some point to somebody. And then that's how they would do that. I remember I did a case from a murder of David Swinehart, who was the millionaire real estate developer in the western part of the county. He was murdered on January 15th, 1982. And the murderers were four guys, two of whom were his nephews. One of his nephews was the captain of the football team at Pottstown High School. And that man was having an affair with his aunt by marriage, Patricia Swinehart, and she had gotten her nephews to recruit these other two guys to murder her husband before he could change over his insurance policies to favor his children and not her. And that case was chronicled for years and years because the dead man had figured out that his nephew was having an affair with his wife and wiretapped his own telephone and caught them engaging in conversations that were described as incriminating. The law doesn't permit me to say what they were, but I have heard them. 2 times we took the case to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court asking for permission to use these recordings after David was murdered.
Because by default, they'd be inadmissible.
They're inadmissible because they were a violation of the state's wiretap law, which has since changed, I understand. And that's because a Speaker of the House of Pennsylvania had gotten jammed up in a wiretap one time, and that's how come Pennsylvania has one of the hardest wiretaps in the state. But and 2 times the Supreme Court said, no, you may not use these recordings. So I ended up prosecuting 3 of the 5 killers, and another prosecutor did 2 others. And there was newspaper articles going back a decade or more of headlines, and the cases of historical significance to anybody who studied the failure of the savings and loan industry and the creation of the Resolution Trust Company. One of the banks that failed, that was part of setting off the savings and loan scandal, was Red Hill Savings and Loan. Red Hill Savings and Loan was overextended in loans to David Swinehart, the real estate developer, who had bought all this property but couldn't develop it because he couldn't afford to, because interest rates in the late 70s under Carter and the early 80s under Carter, and then as Reagan was coming in, were so high that he couldn't afford to pay the mortgages on the property at the same time that he would have to develop the properties. So as we all know historically, Reagan's coming into office and his policies drove interest rates down, but Swinehart was murdered only 1 year into Reagan's presidency before the economic policies of the Reagan administration could correct the hyperinflation and the high interest rates. And as a result, Red Hill Savings and Loan had to default because Swinehart was dead and was not able to pay back any of the mortgages that he had taken out. And that set off a chain of events that was part of what led to the Resolution Trust Company and the failure of the savings and loan industry.
There's that butterfly effect again.
Had Swinehart not been murdered, we know historically that the interest rates would have come down. He would have refinanced those mortgages on all those properties. He would then have had money to develop those properties, and Red Hill would not have folded. Perhaps then the savings and loan industry would have survived, and we would not have had the Resolution Trust Company or the disasters of the failure of those banks.
Based on your experience, what have you seen why people murder?
Well, it's usually
love or money,
or in the course of committing a felony, which usually the felony has to do with sex or money, robbery or burglary, rape, occasionally kidnapping. I had a kidnapping murder one time. Arsons are usually for some monetary reason, and somebody will die. So yeah, it's usually has to do with money or sex. And I separate sex and love because
they're different things.
Yeah, I mean, But those are the two major things. And those are the way, I mean, people say the first thing you look at is the spouse. Well, sometimes that's like you talk about Craig Rabinowitz. Craig Rabinowitz murdered his wife for money in order so that he could run off with the stripper. And pay back his family members who had invested in his phony latex glove business. So when the police come and Stephanie Rabinowitz is dead in the bathtub, the house is all locked up and there's no evidence of forced entry. And people say, well, he must be the dumbest killer on the face of the planet to murder his wife and not make it look like somebody came in. But that's not true because she was Jewish and they were supposed to put her bury her within 24 hours. And there was no evidence of foul play until she was autopsied. Had she not been autopsied, she would have gone in the ground and we would have gotten toxicology perhaps weeks later that showed Ambien in her system. And maybe I could have gotten her exhumed and maybe the autopsy would have helped me then, but maybe not. But if it was only because Dr. Fillinger, the world-famous forensic pathologist, who was then coroner of Montgomery County, ordered there was to be an autopsy because he said 29-year-old women simply don't fall and die in their bathtubs. And, of course, when her body was opened, they were able to find – Dr. Hood found strangulation marks under the skin and she knew it was a murder. But if that doesn't occur – she goes in the ground and he gets away with it. But if the police show up and there's a broken window, now they immediately begin investigating it as a murder. We look for who has a motive. He has a motive. He would have been immediately in our sights.
And do you see that in a lot of cases or a decent amount where something's caught because somebody just has a gut feeling, it just presses it, like Dr. Fillinger, who's from Philadelphia originally, Herbert Fillinger.
Yeah, Halbert Fillinger. Halbert E. Fillinger Jr. was deputy chief medical examiner of Philadelphia, and a world-famous forensic pathologist. There's no other way to say it. I remember him telling me one time, I did a murder where a young woman was sexually assaulted and murdered in her home in Pottstown. It was a death penalty case. The guy's name was Thomas Hawkins. He had murdered another woman in Berks County when he was a juvenile, served a term, got out, and then murdered this girl. And I'm showing the pictures to Dr. Fillinger years afterwards, and we solved the case, and I arrested him, and he said, you see this picture? And it was a picture of the poor girl who was dead, and she had her brassiere flipped up over her chest so that her breasts were showing. And Dr. Fillinger said, you see this picture? And I go, yeah. He goes, that means that the killer sucked on her breasts. And I looked at him and said, how could you possibly know that? He says, I'm telling you, that's what this photograph means. So I go back in the logs and I find that they took swabs off of her breasts and I send them to the lab. Don't you know it comes back not only with saliva, but it comes back with saliva of a person who secretes their blood type into their saliva, which is a very small population. And it secreted the blood type of AB negative, which itself is a very rare blood type. Only 0.6% of the population are AB secretors, and our suspect happened to be one of them.
Thank God for talented people.
Isn't that unbelievable?
Yeah.
I looked at them and said, there's no way you could know that. But you do enough of this stuff, you begin to develop an instinct about it. Sometimes you're wrong, but oftentimes you're not. I was asked not too long ago in an interview how many murder cases I had worked on, and I had to calculate it from the number of years that I was in charge or a deputy in charge of those kind of cases, and it probably is in the area of 300 or so. One of my partners in doing that, Oscar Vance, is probably around 800.
Yeah.
But now, Oscar is another legendary law enforcement figure. You see that many cases, and there's only a limited number of motives, so you start figuring out possible motives and start looking around for who might have one of those possible motives. You'd be surprised how quickly you can narrow the field and eliminate people. Occasionally you do have the Lisa Mandarak, Devin Mandarak killing with a stranger. But that's the rare thing. Usually it's somebody who has some connection with the victim whether it be money or marriage or a secret crush, as we had with John Eichinger, who had a crush on one of the Greaves girls, and murdered her when she didn't return his love, and murdered her sister and her daughter because they were witnesses to the killing, and then murdered another girl who was an unrequited lover. You look to see who has some connection, and if you can't eliminate them, you start working on them.
And do you feel like in sometimes cases, with Rob, do you think that his arrogance and that his intelligence in one area would instantly grant him intelligence in another area helped you?
Yeah, I mean, it gets quoted a lot. I said it sort of a wise guy thing, but when we were doing Rob, somebody asked me, this guy is PhD from Penn with all these degrees and blah, blah, blah. How could he think he could get away with this? And I said that he might be smarter than we are, but remember, he's still an amateur killer, and we're professional catchers of killers. So and I said that as kind of a joke, but it ends up getting repeated a lot.
I was trying to get that quote out of you. That's
and it's astonishing how often people repeat that, but it ends up being true. I mean, this is what we did. I mean, this was my main job from the time I was put in charge of the major crimes unit until the time I left the DA's office. My main job was to catch killers, and I had to do administrative stuff and politics and whatnot. But everything came to a halt when somebody was killed, and to this day, I am consulted by prosecutors around the country on things, and certainly around the state. Sometimes I will go to other offices in the state and help the prosecutors there because I had an opportunity to learn a skill that almost no one has an opportunity to do, and I'm flattered to be asked to do that, and I like helping people, and very seldom do I ever does anyone ever know that. One of my greatest professional achievements is the wrong word, accolades came from the very famous prosecutor the fraternity of people who operate at this level is a relatively small group in Pennsylvania, and we all know each other. And if people remember who Joe McGettigan is, Joe McGettigan was a longtime homicide prosecutor in Philadelphia, was first assistant DA to Pat Meehan in Delaware County, prosecuted DuPont for killing the wrestler Dave Schultz, and also is well known for prosecuting and convicting Sandusky. He was first assistant DA in Philly, and he got tired of telling Seth Williams no, so Seth Williams, the guy who's now in jail, fired him as first assistant DA of Philly. The next day, he was put in charge for the Attorney General's Office of the prosecution of Sandusky. This is the level of guy we're talking about. He prosecuted a fellow named Arthur Bomar, who murdered a woman named Amy Willard
on 422.
On 422
yeah.
in Delaware County, and in that case, the Delaware County detectives, led by First Assistant DA McGettigan, discovered Arthur Bomar's car in Hatfield, Montgomery County. In Delaware County, there's a rule that the district attorney has to approve search warrants, and they just assumed that we had a similar rule. That's a rule that's adopted by order of the DA, and we did not have such a rule. So when other counties would ask me to approve their search warrants, I would say, you go talk to your own DA because it's your risk to take. It's not my risk to take. So the Delaware County detectives came up to meet with me to ask me to review their warrant, and I looked at it, and it was terrible. And I said, I called Joe, and I said, this is not going to make it. And he asked me if I would help them in rewriting the warrant. So I spent all of a Friday afternoon. I remember my car broke down. My old Corvette broke down on the way home late that Friday night, and my wife had to come get me, and it was a big hassle. So I remember that distinctly. And it turned out it was just a wire had come loose. But, it's nighttime. We're going to find the wire. So I rewrote the warrant for them, and they get the car, and in the trunk of the car is Amy Willard's blood. And that was the critical piece of evidence that they won that case with. And when they won the case, he said publicly that I was the one who was owed the public's adoration for helping them win that case because I helped them with that search warrant. And I thought that was a really nice thing to say. But I always liked